Hey, everybody. It is Friday, Bloody Friday. If you're watching the crypto markets today, don't. But we're back with another episode of FUD with Friends, and I'm joined by a good friend of ours, Halcyon from Chaos Labs. How you doing, brother?
Hey, good. Thanks, man. Great to be back on, JD. Thanks for having me. Halcyon, head of BD at Chaos Labs. For those who don't know about Chaos, we're a risk management and quantitative research firm. We work with a lot of the top DeFi protocols out there: Aave, GMX, DYDX, Jupiter, etc. Of course. So yeah, pleasure to be on and excited to crack into it.
Amazing. Yeah, excited to have you. For those of you just tuning in that didn't hear us talking about it earlier in the week, the topic of today's conversation is security. Security kind of as a broad phrase. Halcyon is obviously head of BD at Chaos Labs, and we talk a lot about economic risk management and economic security and different ways to help mitigate that. But again, we're also very focused as a collective on what is the greater security of the space as a whole. So hopefully today we're going to talk about some of that stuff. We're going to go through a little bit of just some numbers and some a little bit staggering in terms of some of the breaches, security breaches that have happened over the course of the last year. We're going to talk about some Bitcoin core vulnerabilities and what that means, and if they're going to publish those things. So we're going to talk about a little oops from some CertiK bug bounty platform, or from their platform. They have a couple of oopses that again, we were going to have actually Mikhail from CertiK on today as well with us, but he wasn't able to make it because of Brussels. But anyways, we're going to talk about economic security and how the U.S. kind of perceives security in general and specifically with crypto and DeFi. And then we're probably just going to chat a little bit about, how to help protect yourself. What are some of the kind of user facing solutions for some of these security risks. And then we'll probably talk a little bit at the very end about economic risk, which I know is Halcyon's big thing. We'll talk a little bit about that and some of the solutions you guys provide and how you help clients, and then we'll wrap it up. So without any more of me talking, let's go. You don't quite look like Ceara in that graphic, but we'll let it slide for today. All right, brother. So, there's a lot of stuff going on. If you've been around the space for a little bit, this is really nothing new. Every cycle, every kind of bullish market, which is hard to argue that we're in right now, but every type of market like that, there's a significant increase in security exploits, economic exploits. There's significant risk in phishing and all of these other things. But some people are actually calling this a catastrophe. It's the crypto catastrophe. So what they're saying is in the first half of 2024, DeFi and cryptocurrency sectors have witnessed an alarming 1.19 billion in losses in half a year due to hacks, scams, and exploits. This synopsis provides an overview of the key incidents and trends impacting crypto security based on recent reports from CertiK and DWallet Labs, as well as insights from other security experts. Phishing attacks, in this particular case, were the most detrimental, with almost 500 million lost across 150 incidents, which means each incident is somehow encountering high asset values every time, which is kind of crazy. Obviously, they're sophisticated. Private key compromises are, a big chunk of that. You get phishing attack, they get your private keys, whatever. Anyways, Halcyon, have you ever been, scammed by a phishing attack?
Back in the day, I think one of the early NFT drops I got involved in, it happened one-off, and then I think from that point onwards, I was always a fair bit more cautious. I think it's really interesting, right? It's a combination of like attackers getting more sophisticated in terms of like impersonations, phishing, et cetera, as well as like just having many more sort of new entrants to the space. Obviously, like with, you know, the Bitcoin ETF being approved like earlier this year, like I think a lot more people coming into the space, people who aren't used to needing to be that vigilant and be very cautious about what transactions they're signing, that they have like 2FA enabled. So some of these like really basic security considerations that you might think people adopt widely. When you're new to the space, it's maybe not something that you're always thinking about.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. I mean, that's part of why we're doing these shows. I'm a little bit of a stuck record on this thing. I mean, if it seems too good to be true, it likely is. If it's asking you to, you know, divulge personal information, like your private key would be akin to like someone asking for your social security number, probably worse than your social security number. But if someone came up to you and said, hey, can I have your social security number? Like you think about that naturally. And you should do the same thing here. Do you know them? Do you trust them? Is there a way to verify that they are who they say they are and that they are going to do what they say they're going to do? These things are really important. But again, people come into the space, euphoria, you know, we're going to make all this money. Everybody's playing with shit coins and we're going to, you know, whatever, turn $100 into $1 million. And then this stuff happens. And it can happen to the best of us. I'll share a little story no, knock on wood, I've never had my private keys breached or anything. We have I think a pretty robust system, but nonetheless, I mean, I've been scammed many times. I got one of those. Binance was down for a few hours, and their official Twitter, which wasn't their official Twitter, it was a spoof, suggested that, you know, to compensate people, they were, and this sounds ridiculous in hindsight, but if you sent a couple ETH, it was like a multiplier contract, so it'd send back some multiple of that. Yeah, that didn't work. So I sent 10 ETH at the time. And lost all of it, obviously. Now, I mean, 10 ETH back then wasn't worth what it is now, but it's still, I mean, it can happen. And I was already here for way too long to admit that. So I'm not telling the story to embarrass myself, but more to say, in fact, it can happen to anybody. What are your kind of best practices, Halcyon, you think? I mean, obviously there's a lot of hacks. There's a lot of things that we can't necessarily control, but in terms of just, you know, keeping your personal wallets as safe as possible, what are some best practices you can think of here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is just having like 2FA enabled, like across all accounts that link to value that you hold. I hold the majority of mine like in cold storage, to, you know, just as a caution, like against, like we've seen a number of exchange hacks in the last year and the years preceding that. So I don't feel entirely comfortable having like the vast majority of my holdings sitting on an exchange. But yeah, I think 2FA is like a really interesting one because it sounds so basic, but I've seen so many teams with core members who've been in the space forever, who have had their socials hacked, who have had exchanges hacked, like obviously like the other one is like SIM swapping is like obviously a big one. So just having like multiple lines of defense, I think is critical, right? To ensuring that you're as protected as possible.
Well, in 2FA, that's actually a really good point. I mean, if they can get through the first line of defense, it's a totally different hacking kind of approach to then get through the 2FA. So you're more than doubling the work, most likely. And so obviously that makes a huge difference. I mean, I've been kind of a stuck record on this, but the payoff for these types of exploits is, even with, you know, how much you lose to fencing the cache and all of this other stuff, is still so bloody high that there's incentive for large groups of fairly sophisticated actors to continue to find ways to exploit individuals and protocols. One quick kind of thought question on this one before we move on. One of the I think catalysts for this, both very recently and going forward, is going to be AI. How some of the malware is being open sourced, and a lot of this stuff is now not only just the intelligence of the people trying to hack you, but essentially collective intelligence of all hackers so to speak, or all exploits in the past. How do you think we adjust to that changing landscape? Do you think there's a way that we can protect ourselves from more and more sophisticated phishing attacks and malware attacks and all these different things?
Well, I think like the initial response that would come to mind would be like, okay, how can we leverage AI to also improve like line of defense and protective measures against those? The issue is that a lot of these protective sort of features or mechanisms developed post-attacks, right? So as I suppose you have new like protocols or like new products that come into the space, there are like new attack vectors, especially as you mentioned with the value that's at stake. People are incentivized to come up with new and innovative ways to exploit funds from people. So it's difficult because you're sort of always playing catch up, right?
Actually, sorry to interrupt you. That's actually a pretty interesting parallel, I think, for Chaos Labs. For what you guys do, for even from an economic perspective. With that in mind, how do you balance trying to understand emerging risk vectors prior to them being an existing exploit example? Do you guys try to split your time on R&D, or is it really just the space is so crowded right now that we have to find just responses to what's happening?
So, great question. We have a huge R&D team. I suppose the difficult thing about risk management is, firstly, like a core component of like any risk model is like aggregating market data, right? And when you have new products, like let's take restaking for an example, right? Before like redemptions became live, it's very hard to predict the different behavior of different actors or different stakeholders, right? And so it's very hard to construct agents for like agent-based modeling and simulations when it's a new product and you just haven't seen sort of how the market responds or how key agents respond to different forces listed by that new product or that new protocol. So a lot of it is trying to just understand new protocols as best as we can, learn the behavior of the protocol. And then often if it's like a new type of product, you have to come up with like synthetic data to try and simulate different market conditions or different behaviors from different types of agents as best you can. But it's very hard to build risk models for protocols that are very nascent, which is why like it's a very hard thing to do in this space. And so the difficult thing is, as the space is evolving at such a rapid rate, just as we get used to managing risk for sort of initial like early primitives, you're then having to respond to and sort of
adjust
to exactly to new trends and stuff. It's the same for users as well, right? So if you've been like we were talking about this earlier, if you've been in the space for a while, people might say, okay, you've maybe been scammed a couple of times, so that you have to look out for certain things, and you expect, like, if you see something that sounds too good to be true, as you said it, like it probably is. The difficult thing is when new features come out, right? Like, so let's talk about like smart wallets, for instance, right? It's like something that if you've been in the space for a while, you're like, okay, I've never actually used something like this because it's new technology, right? So if someone is able to develop something that has like a very similar UI and you get tricked somehow, people might say like, oh, you've been in the space like for so long, like, shouldn't you have known not to sign that message or that? And it's really difficult. So there is still a lot of, because everyone in the space, especially like retail as well, it's very hard to always have such a high level of literacy in every part of the space. You naturally do have to rely on some of these different security firms. And it's interesting, like maybe we'll get onto this a bit more later, but we don't see like a lot of acquisitions in the Web3 or crypto space, but we're seeing more and more wallet providers looking to acquire some of these sort of like firewall services or like phishing detection services and stuff. I think this might be something we're covering shortly.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me. It's very intuitive.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of optimizing user experience and consumer risk management and so on. I mean, the thing with all the moving parts of a very novel space is that in this particular case, any ignorance with respect to any one of them can be kind of catastrophic for your portfolio. Okay, so we talked a little bit about kind of the sophistication of malware. My belief is that we'll probably use the same technological advancements on our side as they're using on their side. So we can probably use, AI to facilitate model development and simulation development. We can probably use different machine learning structures and, technical innovations to build more robust protocols, I suppose, in the face of this. Another thing that's been prevailing, that's also been helping the scammers, but arguably could help the space as a whole, is shedding light on some of these things and open sourcing more and more of security processes. So another example that came up over the last couple of days is Bitcoin Core's new security policy reveals vulnerabilities now publicly. And so there's been a lot of backlash on this, but in an effort to enhance transparency and security, Bitcoin Core developers have introduced a new policy to disclose security vulnerabilities, acknowledging past shortcomings and publicizing such issues. The move aims to address a misconception that Bitcoin is essentially infallible, and it promotes a more informed and cautious approach among users. Okay. Do you think this is good or bad on the whole?
I won't say I think it's good. I think it's like the ethos of this space, right, is built on transparency and trustlessness. So I think, and open source, right? So I think it's important that people understand the risks when they're tying up funds like anywhere, because maybe there are these preconceptions that if I park my money here, it's completely secure. I understand, on the other side, I understand why teams are against it, right? Like some of the biggest DeFi protocols in the space from time to time will work with security auditors to expose when like a significant bug is like uncovered, right? But I understand why those teams prefer not to, because it makes users instantly question the security of that protocol. And as we're trying to increase adoption and stuff, like the more, I suppose, like security breaches or bugs that people hear about, the more cautious they are about using applications built on that technology, right?
You brought up an interesting point in the last segment, that in slowly, I suppose, evolving and paying attention to, again, both sides of the coin, kind of what is happening, where is attention being spent with respect to exploits. This now can highlight that and hopefully lead to quicker innovation to plug holes. The real challenge here is, when do you disclose this information? Because the argument here is you disclose it early enough so that many groups of people and many smart people can start thinking about solutions. The flip side is, if you expose it too soon, there's also malicious people that could be, now starting to think about this. Where do you land on that? What do you think is the, if we were to build like the perfect model, which is probably impossible, but if we were to build a model for when and how to kind of publicly open source this stuff, where do you think that kind of sweet spot is?
I think like the way it works today, which I think works sort of well, is when there has been a bug that's been uncovered, protocols usually will work or like coordinate closely with and collaborate closely with security partners to patch it up first. And so they'll let sort of the teams they work with very closely know, but they don't maybe publicly disclose it until the bug has been patched up, for the same reason you just mentioned, right? If you're letting everyone know that there's an exploit vector that can be taken advantage of or can be exposed, you're sort of exposing yourself as a protocol. So I think it's a delicate balance, right? It's working with like trusted parties to try and like accelerate the path to covering it up, patching it up is probably a better term. yeah, that's sort of my 2 cents.
I think another thing is the simplest way to protect the protocol is to just pause the protocol. So nothing in, nothing out, nothing happens. Like you just kind of can wait for a minute. Now there's a lot of solutions providers, some incredible ones. I'm not going to list them all because we work with some and not with others, but there's some incredible solutions providers that will, work to identify some of these things programmatically and will auto pause protocols. And there's ways that auditors can push information into these auto pause things. And it's pretty interesting. I think as a space, again, we're innovating on the security front in a lot of ways. I hope that we get to a point where, core protocol exploits and economic exploits are significantly less than they are now. There's always going to be this phishing, private key. Like that's, as long as people have information that can unlock their accounts, which has to be the case forever, there will be people trying to get said information and exploit their accounts. It's just inevitable. But ideally, in the meantime, if we can hopefully reduce some of the other types of exploits, it makes the space a much more viable one for mass adoption. Any final thoughts on that one, or are you cool to move on to?
Well, I just want to quickly build on a final point you mentioned, which is like pausing protocols. I can tell you that from like a market risk standpoint, pausing a market when there's like in adversarial market conditions can be like pretty destructive to a protocol, because it means that maybe you miss periods like where you'd like to be liquidating positions that should be eligible for liquidation. And so the protocol could be taking on bad debt. So the preference is to try and mitigate risk in real time using the controls at your disposal without taking like sort of pulling the ripcord. Yeah. And I think I'm not sure if it's exactly the same for security orders and stuff, but when there's a bug, I wonder if in what circumstances you have no choice but to pause a protocol versus what you can sort of patch up in real time. Because depending on the protocol, like pausing it can also be detrimental as well, right? So sometimes those sorts of actions you want to reserve for like a worst case scenario when you have no other options, right?
And totally, like, I mean, and part of the promise of permissionless DeFi is that in theory, there's little to no human intervention. And so as soon as we intervene and pause some stuff, then obviously we're kind of going against part of the core ethos. And so ideally, like you said, I mean, bug bounties have been a very useful thing in years past. There's obviously, there's some nuisance in bug bounties, obviously, but again, that cadence has seemed to be pretty good because they report the bounty or the bug essentially to the developer first. We figure out if it's a legitimate bug, and then it gets posted, generally speaking, as a paid vulnerability. We've had time then to kind of figure it out. It's just, are people as motivated, and are there as many people working on, bug bounties as there are people on exploits? I don't know. I would argue probably not. I wish there were more white hats, but money talks. Anyways, okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about U.S. national and economic security. I think this is obviously coming to light because of the elections in the U.S. and there's, everybody's trying to figure out how to jockey for votes and so on and so forth. But there was a meeting recently hosted by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is almost tongue-in-cheek these days, but Elaine Dzinski, who's the senior director and head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is quite the mouthful, said essentially they had a pivotal discussion talking about how U.S. policy and finance should explore the intersection of national security with respect to digital finance. And it was a panel that also delved into how the United States can navigate the challenges and opportunities presented by cryptocurrency and DeFi, aiming to strike a balance between innovation and security. So from my perspective, regulators, policymakers, government officials, and so on, I think have been focusing more on perceived security, and that's it. So perceived security by way of like individual security of individual users, and because the space isn't fully understood, we're just saying, hey, we're not going to allow this as a regulated product yet in the US. And if it is a regulated product, most of you can't qualify, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is interesting because if crypto expands beyond kind of our current paradigm, are we in fact now in a weaker position because we're dragging our feet so much on getting up to speed with the rest of the world? I'm interested in your thoughts on this one. Do you think that this is just a voting, people trying to jockey for votes, as I said before, or do you think this is an actual concern that the U.S. really needs to be focused on? The U.S. and other major economies, of course.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's probably used, to capture like certain demographics for presidential candidates. We can see that, but I can speak like mainly. So I'm based out of the UK, so I can speak more so about Europe and the UK. So like the UK, this year there were like a lot of things introduced trying to protect individual users. So any sort of crypto application that you use, you get these notifications that pop out.
I think we lost you, buddy.
At like every stage of like logging in using the I think
we're good now. We had some issues there.
Okay, we're good.
Last year, but I think we're good. It seems your Wi-Fi might be a little.
Cool. Right. I don't know if you could hear what I was saying before, but there's been the introduction of some new policies where, like now, when you use crypto products, you have these notifications that are constantly warning you about the risks of engaging with crypto products at every sort of interval of like logging in and then using the product itself. I think that level of caution and warning spooks new entrants to the space, so is like not great for adoption. I think unfortunately, we as it being a growing technology and seeing the number of, so the frequency of, and also the severity of exploits, I can understand why policymakers and stuff are so concerned about preserving the security of individuals who are starting to use different crypto products. I think it's important, countries make decisions as to whether they want to be sitting at the frontier of innovation in the space, or wanting to sort of see other nations experiment first before sort of committing more resources. And so, it seems like the US is, in many states, has taken more of like a hostile approach. And so, they're definitely, to what you were saying before, playing catch up. You see a lot of nations that have been sort of more embracive of new technology and promoting or advocating for innovation, have also had an inflow of immigrants who come to those places, Dubai, Portugal, Singapore. You have like a lot of people who are coming to those places who want to be sitting at the frontier of this innovation. So you definitely stifle or impede like growth by taking a more stringent approach, right?
Yeah. Another thing that they're talking a lot about is the oversight with respect to like terrorist financing and financing crime and all of these things. We can maybe talk about that on an episode in and of itself. Ceara and I talk about this quite a bit, but you did allude to something a little bit earlier with respect to, different wallets and that being kind of one of the core categories of where we can really improve this. And along that vein, Consensus acquired Wallet Guard for MetaMask. Are you familiar with this acquisition?
Yeah, I am. And it's, I think I was saying before, it seems super intuitive to me, right? Like if you have software like that you've seen work super well for a company like Consensus to have coverage across like all your products, makes a lot of sense. And it signals the emphasis that you're placing on security. Like there are a lot of brands in this space who have done a great job of doing that, right? Like Coinbase is another one that has that sense of security attached to the brand. There are a few other like companies like that in the space, but it's an acquisition that sort of makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's there's a lot of wallets now that are starting to do like social recovery or private key recovery through more than two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. And they've been able to decentralize this in a lot of ways. And I think that's pretty interesting as well. If the user doesn't know their private key, it's pretty hard to give it away. That being said, they have to have multiple other ways to secure their account. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, something really interesting is we've obviously spoken about like a lot of the risks, like on the user side for security, right? Like a lot of new entrants are coming into the space and not being well versed in different security best practices, but also like a lot of developers who, when crypto is like the hot thing, come into the space to learn, Solidity or Viper or whatever, and contribute to some of these projects, are possibly like also not fully aware of the security best practices. Like you still see like a lot of security breaches related to people accidentally exposing their private key, like in the code repo, right? That's open source. So like there's also, a lot of enablement and work to be done on the developer side as well to make sure that these applications are safe. There's some really interesting educational resources that are being developed by great teams, like Cyphren being like one example. Like Patrick Collins has done a lot of like really interesting like enablement work there for up and coming developers.
Amazing. Okay. We talked about this a little bit before, and we're there's a couple of articles that are all generally around the same topic here, but this is with respect to Open Bounty's public bug reporting, which is a CertiK kind of spin out, I think, to compete with like Immunify and other bug bounty programs. Essentially what happened is they're under scrutiny right now because there were sensitive bug reports that were posted publicly on Shen2, which is a public blockchain. Security experts criticize this practice as obviously highly irresponsible. At least that's what they're claiming, highlighting the potential risks of exploits by malicious entities. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes open sourcing the problem can lead to faster and more robust responses to said problem. It also, again, as we said, does the opposite. It lets the potential exploiters know how to exploit the protocol. We've now removed all of the barrier to entry. And so I guess, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is net good long-term and people just aren't used to it yet, and we haven't created new heuristics for how to adjust to this? Or do you think this really is directed criticism in a meaningful way?
My personal thoughts, sort of continuing off the of our conversation earlier, is that the malicious attackers and the different strategies they have for exploiting protocol stuff, I think is always going to be slightly leading the security side of things, just because, as we were talking about this, but like as innovation accelerates and new technologies are introduced, new exploit vectors, I think, will come up before we understand like how to protect ourselves against them. So I'm slightly torn because I think whilst it's good to have as many, like bring together as many smart minds as possible to sort of like work on finding solutions to like some of these exploit vectors, the more public you make them, I think just being aware of that the more likely they are to be exposed. So I think my general stance is that you want to share open exploits or gaping holes with trusted parties, and try and patch them up as soon as possible. And then I think it's pretty critical to share key learnings afterwards, like so people fully understand the exploit vector, how it came about, and then best practices for protecting against it. But yeah, I think it can be pretty dangerous if it's like still a live exploit vector to be sort of opening it up to everyone. But that's just a personal.
I mean, as a space, I think we just need to get better. We need to get better at assessing and kind of responding to these types of situations, right? And I mean, I think we agree that in the end, transparency is ideal. You open source is valuable for many reasons, of course, but it needs to be done somewhat strategically. You can't just blast this out to the general public on moment one. You have to make sure that you've plugged the hole, put flex tape clear on it for now, and you're going to figure out how to fix it while you're still driving the boat later on. I think that's where I would fall on that. Okay, we were going to talk a little bit about some Certic drama with Kraken, but maybe we'll pause and talk about that another day. Okay, so for everybody watching, every second Friday we do FUD with Friends. And FUD with Friends is, we pick a topic that seems to be prevailing, bring an expert or two from that respective field, and then just come and get your insights and have a chat. So Halcyon, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate having you on. Hopefully we've helped people understand that the space does have a lot of risk. Don't be naive. Don't assume that anything is infallible. Be careful. But there's still a lot of promise. And I think, in the end, I feel confident and excited about the amount of people that are thinking about solutions to some of these problems. And I think we're going to have a much better outlook in the years to come. So my friend, super duper appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. Any kind of final thoughts coming from the economic perspective before we sign off? Anything else that you think people should be paying attention to, or if their friends or family are coming into the space, kind of what are your suggestions of where to send them and what they should be focusing on?
Yeah, I think like the first thing I'd say is, just because you've been in the space a while doesn't mean you're immune to these sorts of security breaches. So always be cautious. Try and understand as best you can, what you're signing or what you're engaging in. And then also just from our discussion today, you can tell that there's a lot of space for new and innovative like security technology. So if you're a developer that's looking for something to build, it's an open space, and you can see with what we covered earlier that big firms like Consensus will acquire great solutions. So there's a lot of incentive to
keep going.
Contribute. Yeah, good stuff.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, super appreciate it. I think we could go on again for hours. Excited to have you back on. But for today, everybody have a great weekend. Like, share, subscribe, click the bell so that you never miss another episode. And today I say to you, my friend, go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself, JD.
Later.
With that, I have to say, go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself.